welcome back to the podcast and welcome back to a returning guest. And I'm sure, like many of you out there, you know this guest quite well. You've been listening to him, of course, through Philosophy Bites and reading his books, such as Wittgenstein's Poker, which we spoke about on this podcast a couple of years ago now. This is David Edmonds. David, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. Good to be back.
So today we're going to be speaking about a book of yours called The Murder of Professor Schlick, The Rise and Fall of the Vienna Circle. And I might kick this off as a sort of teaser towards a murder mystery, though it's not going to be that. But I might start like this. So in Vienna on a Monday, 22nd of June, 1936, a young man called Johann Neblig wakes up and he goes to the University of Vienna, where he was a student and a doctoral candidate. And an hour later, he shoots his previous teacher, his former professor of his, in the heart 4 times with an automatic pistol. And as you say, many of the things that he brings up at the trial are manufactured. But he talks about love, he talks about ideology, and he also talks about logical positivism. And the man he shot is Professor Schlick. So from that, and we'll get to that at the end of the podcast again, let's wind back. What was the Vienna Circle and who was Professor Schlick?
Professor Schlick, who was shot by Nailbook on that day, on Monday, June the 22nd, was the founder and the leader of the Vienna Circle. So he had arrived in Vienna in 1922, and the Vienna Circle got going in about 1924. And it was a group of thinkers who were all sort of well disposed towards science, and many of them were scientifically trained. It was a group of thinkers who would meet regularly to discuss philosophical questions of logic, and for a brief time in the 1920s and early 1930s, they had founded a movement, logical positivism, and it was probably the most fashionable philosophical movement in the world. And Schlick was a sort of quiet, dignified, unassuming leader of that group of thinkers.
What were we're going to build up, I'm sure, throughout the podcast, what logical positivism is. There's a lot of elements there. But what were they trying to achieve overall, this movement?
Well, fundamentally, they were an anti-metaphysical movement. I suppose that was the key element. So they despised the metaphysics of Immanuel Kant. He was one of their bêtes noires. Heidegger, who was a contemporary of theirs, was another bête noire. They believed that really philosophy had to be grounded in the empirical world, and that there shouldn't be speculations about things which humans had no access to and potentially could have no access to. So essentially it was an anti-metaphysical movement, and I think that was the single kind of ideological piece that gelled them all as thinkers.
You mentioned there one of the enemies, of course, Heidegger, but who were the champions? In front of me, I've been reading your book again recently, and of course Wittgenstein is there, but there's also people like Russell and Ernst Mach. So what were the influences of the circle?
Yes, so their ideology, I guess, was called logical positivism, and there were 2 elements to that. We've talked a bit about their positivism, which was about the kind of scientific worldview, but they also brought to their philosophy the new logic, and the new logic had been created by people like Frege and Bertrand Russell. So Russell and Frege were very important figures, and they had introduced a new form of logical notation, a way of describing logic and use symbolism with logic. And Wittgenstein was another key inspiration for the movement. So Wittgenstein, I guess we might talk about this later, but Wittgenstein did various things for the Vienna Circle, but perhaps most important, they took the verification principle from Wittgenstein. So they came to believe that if a proposition was not in principle verifiable, if it couldn't be tested, then it was meaningless, unless it was true by virtue of the definition of the term. So something like all bachelors are unmarried men, that made a kind of sense. It was a tautology, but it was true in virtue of the meaning of the terms. Something like water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, that also had meaning because it could be tested in the real world. You could get a glass of water and you could heat it up and you could see whether it did boil at 100 degrees centigrade. Whereas there were statements about religion, there were statements about aesthetics, that there were statements about morality that could not be tested. And so, according to the logical positivists, the group that Slick led, those were meaningless statements. So statements like, I don't know, God wants you to do X, or statements like Beethoven is a superior composer to Mozart, or statements like murder is wrong, those either had to be redefined in a way that made sense in logical positivist terms, or were meaningless. They were sort of literally meaningless. They made no sense. And so that was a very radical philosophy, obviously, and one which in the fullness of time hasn't really stood up. But that was what they were known for.
And just to clarify, this is not a definition between what's true and not true. It's simply that such a claim about God could be possibly true, but it's a meaningless statement because it's unverifiable.
Well, it was because it couldn't be tested, it was meaningless. There were statements which were meaningful but false. So a statement like water boils at 80 degrees centigrade was a perfectly meaningful statement. It was just false. But statements that were that couldn't be tested and were in principle untestifiable were neither true nor false. They were meaningless.
Now you enter we will get to more on the verification there a little later, but one of the aspects of this that you mentioned in the book, I think this is your own input here, it's about history. And for example, you may make a claim about Caesar crossing a boundary back in the day, and we may not have the evidence for it yet, so it's technically untestable and unverifiable in this sense. But it doesn't mean that there won't be verifiable evidence that comes in the future, such as there's another case that you put in the book. You say something like, what if someone were to say in the 1920s that a man will step on the moon in 1960s? In some way, there's a verifiable aspect to it, but it also lacks immediate verification. And I don't get too much into the weeds of the verification principle because it does bounce around an awful lot. But there are some immediate challenges with it that you put in the book.
Yeah, so they had this verification principle, and then the question that arose was, well, what counted as verification? Statements about history presented a whole set of challenges because it looks like it makes perfect sense to make historical claims like Julius Caesar. I think I don't know if I had this version of the book, but an example I quite like: Julius Caesar ate a boiled egg. Well, would they boiled eggs in those days? They probably would. In X on a particular morning on a particular day of a particular year. Now that looks like it makes perfect sense, but it can't be verified. But you might say, well, in principle, it is verifiable because you could imagine that you found a scroll of paper in which somebody had been observing Julius Caesar on that day and noted down what he ate for breakfast. So in principle, it was verifiable, even if in practice it was extremely unlikely to be verified. You mentioned the problem with claims, scientific claims. What occurs on the far side of the moon, for example, which would have been a question that didn't look like it could be verified in 1924. But in principle, it was verifiable, because you could imagine, we subsequently humans landed on the moon. So you could verify those kinds of statements. So there was disagreement about what counted as verification. And that was one of the things that they would discuss in their regular meetings. But yes, to what extent how far the verification principle ran was a central part of their debate. They got into trouble, of course, at the end, because it looked like that the verification principle itself is not verifiable. So if I say a statement is only meaningful if it can either be tested or if it's true by definition, that itself is not a verifiable statement. There's no way I can verify that or test that, and it's not true by the definition of the terms. So the verification principle in and of itself looks like it's meaningless by the criteria that the logical positivists have set up. So that was another problem for them.
Perhaps this is why so it will come back to verificationism a little later on, but you mentioned Wittgenstein just then, and perhaps this is why they admired him so much, that claim within the Tractatus that at some point you have to build things up and then knock away the ladder afterwards, after you, that some things can't be reached and you have to just live them as they are. But I might get you to talk about the extraordinary place that Wittgenstein had within this community. He was discovered after he'd written the Tractatus, I think by Weizmann. And there's a quote I'm going to use here, and this is from a young member of the circle, Olotowski. And he said that the Tractatus was used to settle almost all disputes within the circle as the last authority. And between 1925 and 1927, the circle went through the Tractatus, literally line for line, and pulled it apart. So I might get a pause there on just this extraordinary place that Wittgenstein had within a community and a club that he wasn't a member of and didn't want to be a member of.
Yes. So one minor correction. So Olotowski was a woman, not a man. No, that's very important, because actually, most unusually for the time, there were a whole series of female philosophers who were involved in the Vienna Circle, and she was one of them. Rose Rand was another, and there was Olga Neurath was a third. So Towski mentions how important Wittgenstein is to the group. They admired him so much that they spent a couple of years analyzing every sentence of the Tractatus, going through it sentence by sentence. They were desperate for Wittgenstein to come along and address the group, and he always refused, but he did agree to meet a few of them separately, and Slick went off to meet them, and they talk about, there's a quote about, I think from Slick's wife, about him going to meet Wittgenstein as though he was going on a pilgrimage. And Weizmann was another one who had dealings with Wittgenstein. So a few of them would meet, and then they would report back about what Wittgenstein had said. And famously, Wittgenstein was sometimes, when he met them, not in the mood to talk philosophy, so he would turn his back on them and he would read poetry aloud to them. So, I mean, he was never much one for interacting with human beings on a sort of typical basis, Wittgenstein, but you do get these extraordinary stories about him and the Vienna Circle, and sort of they worshipped him. It was very asymmetrical, the relationship, and he treats some of them very badly. He treats Weizmann in particular very, very badly indeed. But yeah, he was a heroic figure to the circle.
I might take a moment here to ask you a personal question about this. How do you see the Vienna Circle? For many people outside philosophy, when they'll still know the name of the Vienna Circle. And for anyone that's been engaged in any sort of niche subject, like I suppose many aspects of philosophy are, The one thing many people desperately want is a group of like-minded people who are going to engage deeply on the issue that you care about and meet regularly with new ideas to think about. I think it's almost a philosopher's dream in many ways to have this thing. So I wonder how you see it, looking in there and looking as a philosopher. I mean, I assume many people afterwards wish they'd been there and probably tried to recreate similar circumstances afterwards. And it's just one of those lightning in a bottle kind of moments.
Yeah, so one thing one has to understand about the Vienna Circle is that they meet at an extraordinary period during the life of Vienna, when they're not just these amazing philosophers around. There's a whole bunch of very famous psychoanalysts, of course, led by Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. There's some very important economists. There's some very, very brilliant journalists like Karl Kraus. There are playwrights. There are brilliant painters around like Klimt, scientists. So Vienna is a quite amazing place in the 1920s and 1930s. And there are a whole bunch of circles. So the Vienna Circle is not the only circle. There's an economic circle, there's a mathematics circle. And some of the members of the Vienna Circle are also members of these other circles. And likewise, there are people who mainly go to some other circles, but occasionally come to the Vienna Circle. So the Vienna Circle has to be understood in that context. It didn't just arise spontaneously. There was a culture of circles where people would meet, like-minded people would meet, and they would discuss the cutting-edge areas in their own particular discipline. So it wasn't so weird that the Vienna Circle gets off the ground, because it's happening all over the city. And of course, it's also taking place against the background of a very difficult political situation. So Austria has once been part of this great empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then World War One, it is defeated, and the empire is split up, and Austria becomes a very small, relatively provincial city, having been the center of this huge empire. So sort of it takes a great deal of psychological adjustment, I think, for people in Vienna. Vienna is governed at that time by a left-wing government. It's known as Red Vienna, but Vienna is politically very different from the rest of Austria. So Austria is very Catholic, very conservative. Vienna at that period is socialist and more secular, and there's a big Jewish community, and things obviously are going to go terribly wrong, and there's the looming threat from the far right, who are growing in strength, and the fascists take over in Vienna in 1934, and that signals the beginning of the end of the Vienna Circle. One of the interesting aspects of the Vienna Circle is that they were quite political, and trying to make sense of that is very difficult, because although they were mainly of the left, and some indeed were communists or Marxists, Otto Neurath, one of the most colorful members of the Vienna Circle, was a Marxist. Although they themselves were politically engaged, they thought that quite a few political, as indeed ethical, statements were meaningless. So trying to make sense of their engagement with politics, and the idea that nonetheless quite a few of these normative statements about politics made no sense. Trying to make sense of how that worked is very, very tricky. But it's another thing that makes the Vienna Circle so interesting, and possibly makes them feel that their ideas were very urgent, because they were talking and writing and thinking against the background of this very difficult political context.
You mentioned Otto Neurath there, and he has a significant role. I think you write that he signed off on the publication of this. I guess it's a pamphlet or a publication. It's some sort of cover face for the whole movement. It's called the final version you have here is called entitled "The Scientific Conception of the World: The Vienna Circle." And as you just talked about, then this incredibly challenging political environment that was happening all around them. This entry into it is a little provocative in its sense. One, it something makes the disputes of the circle public. It brings people like Carnap and Neurath out into public, but it also brings some of the internal splits within the circle. It exacerbates them in a certain way because suddenly these private arguments we're having, people are publishing about it and saying these ideas match for all of us. And it becomes this incredibly strained document. I mean, from the outside, it's almost hard to see why they published it. It seems like it could have been a significant mistake.
Right. So Moritz Schlick, the person we began our discussion with, he's unusual in the sense that whilst most members of the circle are left-leaning, he's a small c conservative. He's also at odds with the rest of them in that he is happy having a discussion group that is very apolitical. He wants to talk about these questions of verification and logic and so on, and the status of scientific claims. He wants to keep it at a very philosophical level, a very abstruse level, whereas the rest of them are more activist in their leanings. In the late 1920s, Schlick is offered a job elsewhere, and instead of taking it, he decides to stay in Vienna. And as a thank you, other members of the Vienna Circle compile this manifesto without Schlick's knowledge, and they publish it. And for Schlick, it was a very unwelcome gift. It was to thank Schlick for staying in Vienna, but I think he would very much like the manifesto not to have appeared, precisely because it's a very activist document, and it says that the role of the philosopher basically is not just to sort of analyze the world, but to change the world as well. And as you say, from that moment on, the splits in the circle become more prominent, in part because it seems like now it is not just a philosophical group that poses no threat to anybody. It has become a politically activist group.
Now there's a conference that happens a little after that. I don't have it in front of me. I think it's in Paris. And you wrote there was Wittgenstein was already barred from it I think it's a falling out he had with Carnap here. So I might ask about Wittgenstein just once more, I suppose, here. And that's to talk about this idea of clarity and language and logic in those terms. Now, Wittgenstein is offered, I suppose he offers something very important to the circle, where he offered this grounding in language, but he also offered them a path towards absolute clarity. This is before he changes his mind, of course, later, and Paul Weissman has to try to get shorthand versions for the circle itself. But I might open that up to you there and see this important place that language and clarity had within the circle as well.
Yes, so part of the new logic was to bring some clarity to ambivalent, ambiguous language. And with logic, you could, and with notation and symbols, you could make precisely clear, the idea was, what was being expressed. I mean, it's ironic in two ways. One is that Wittgenstein was not the clearest person to understand. Anybody who's ever read Wittgenstein, the Tractatus or his later work, will know that although it's beautifully written, it's not always obvious what he's trying to say, which is partly why the Vienna Circle had to spend so long deciphering it. They themselves, of course, were very anti-bullshit, and it's important to say that clarity was a very high virtue for them, and one of the reasons they were suspicious of a metaphysician like Heidegger was that it was often extremely difficult to work out what he was trying to say. The other irony with Wittgenstein is that they couldn't work out the whole last section of the Tractatus. So they wanted to say that statements about ethics, as I described, and statements about God and aesthetics, they wanted to say that they were meaningless. But Wittgenstein had fought in World War I, and although he'd written most of the Tractatus, he had most of the thinking for the Tractatus was already in place before the war. He began to think differently about certain questions. In particular, he began to think that ethics was impossible to express in kind of scientific language, but in fact it was the most important thing about life. And so the last bit of the Tractatus is totally at odds with the Vienna Circle thinking, because they want to dismiss ethics as meaningless. Wittgenstein wants to say it's difficult, you can't say anything about it, but it's the most important thing. This is what really matters, is ethics. And so the Vienna Circle didn't know how to interpret this last section of the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein begins to talk about the fact that there are some things which just can't be said, but nonetheless are, the fundamentally important aspects of life.
Let's push forward just a little bit then, and I suppose perhaps go back to verificationism just a little bit here. And I suppose the important place, we shouldn't go into Kant. It's not necessary. But one of the figures of the circle were rallying against was Kant. And they found Einstein incredibly useful for this idea of there being a priori knowledge in the world. Einstein showed that even a straight line was curved, for example, and this was a wonderful revelation for the circle itself. But Einstein went to add, and of course the other developments in modern physics went on to add some challenges for the circle in terms of the verification principle. For example, there are modern physics posits unobservables within the universe, and all sorts of strange developments in physics were popping up at the time. People like Tarski, we haven't mentioned, and people like this were coming along with incompleteness theorems, and that was Gödel, sorry, not Tarski. Tarski had his truth, but there's a tremendous amount of change happening around them. And I suppose I might want to ask you just about the verification of how much they batted this issue back and forth, and just why it was so vital that they nailed it down. Because you do quote A.J. Ayer a few times, and at the end, A.J. Ayer said at the end of your book that they got almost everything wrong, and that's because they couldn't nail down this verification principle.
Yes. So Kant had this view about there were synthetic propositions about the world. There were a priori propositions about that you could work out without knowing about the world. And Kant claimed that there were synthetic a priori. So there were things that we could work out about the world from having no experience of the world. So just from sitting in our armchair, there were things that we could say about how the world functioned, not just about mathematical propositions or whatever. And they rejected this idea that there were synthetic a priori propositions, that there were things that we could know about the world without actually testing the world. So that was their beef with Kant. The new physics did provide yet another challenge to the verification principle because, as you say, it posited things going on at the quantum level that looked like we couldn't verify because we couldn't observe them. So the question was, well, how could you verify that they exist? There was all sorts of things going on in the science that they had to try and make sense of, like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which was very, very counterintuitive. And you mentioned Fredier. So Fredier was one of a series of foreign visitors who they'd heard about the exciting philosophy that was going on in Vienna, and they traveled to Vienna. Quine was another one from America. Fredier came over from the UK. And Fredier is a very important figure in the history of the Vienna Circle because he traveled there in the early 1930s. He came back and he writes a book called Language, Truth and Logic, which is published in 1936 when he's only 26 years old. And it's a kind of polemical book, which basically translates the ideas of the logical circle into the Anglo-American world. And so that became the way in which people in the States and people in the UK viewed the Vienna Circle through Ayre's work. So he was basically the translator of it, and he was the transmitter of the ideas of the Vienna Circle to a wider world.
Schlick has this, and we don't have to linger too much on this, I suppose, but Schlick, I think it might be important for people just to get in their minds of how some of these debates were going. Schlick has it in his mind that he's going to help out with the verification principle at one point. And he comes up with this idea. And for example, this is here now patch blue. So everything is in the form of here now, and then a statement afterwards. And he's doing this to remove certain vulnerabilities, such as the deceptive nature of memory and things like this. And it may seem like a archaic kind of argument to have about why can't I say the patch is blue? Why do I need to say here now the patch is blue? But as you write, it had huge ramifications for the circle itself, because they were searching all the time, and Popperians are going to get their ears tweaking when I say this, but they were searching all the time for solid foundations. And one of the members of the group, Otto Neurath, has this wonderful analogy that people call Neurath's boat, where you're always trying to repair it while it's out at sea. And this enraged many of the other members of the group because, it was a foundation, but it wasn't a firm foundation.
Yes. So there are echoes here of Descartes and Descartes building up certainty from solid foundations. And the Vienna Circle wanted to do that too. They wanted to know what was the baseline. And so there was this long and quite bitter debate about protocol sentences, the fundamental sentences, propositions from which you could build up kind of science and certainty, and whether you had to begin with the present or whether you could begin. So that Schlick said you had to begin with present claims, this blue now. Others disagreed about that. So that was what that dispute was all about, and that lasted for several years, working out what were the fundamentals, propositions from which everything else followed. And Neurath's boat, Neurath had this idea that there was no such thing as one fundamental proposition or a few fundamental propositions. What you had was, you had this boat of knowledge, as it were, and if you took out one plank, you could replace it with another plank, but you couldn't replace the whole boat in one go, because then you would sink. And so if we wanted to understand our propositions, our language, we could take each proposition and put it under the microscope in turn, but we couldn't examine the whole thing together. That made no sense.
There's another element here that is going to become important at the very end, and that is the Jewish element in this. A large number of the members of the group were Jewish, but that was, as you mentioned in the book, that's because Vienna was an incredibly multicultural city and a very tolerant city towards Jews at the time. But I want to get into some of the what's the word you use for it? You called anti-Semitism. I have it in front of me somewhere. A protein beast is what you used for it, and you have the and it just chases the members of the circle around. I believe there were people's offices were being raided while they're out of town. I think that was Norath perhaps or Carnap, but also Schlick when he applies for the job as the head of department at the University of Vienna. They check his background to make sure he's not a Jew. And this is a tremendous strain of anti-Semitism, which is important because it's building at the time and becoming worse. But it also feeds into, I suppose, a lot of the fears that are going to happen at the very end of the book, and some of the I suppose strained excuses that Schlick's killer is going to use as well.
Yes, so you talk about the tolerance of Vienna, and that's both true and very false. So it's true to the extent that Jews had been emancipated in the mid 19th century, and there was room for them to go to university, to prosper, and in Vienna, they did indeed, at one level, prosper a great deal. So they were massively overrepresented in journalism, in academia, in very high status roles. There was also an incredible strain of anti-Semitism, and it didn't just pop up with the rise of fascism in the 30s and then later the rise of Nazism, because in Austria the fascists take over in 34 and the fascists are anti-German, and it's only in 38 with the Anschluss that the Nazis take over. But anti-Semitism was a very, very powerful force long before then. Several of the members of the circle were not Jewish. So Carnap was not Jewish. Gödel, the greatest logician of the 20th century and a member of the circle, was not Jewish. And Schlick was not Jewish. Most of the others were Jewish or half Jewish. Otto Neurath was doubly compromised because he was not only Jewish, he was a Marxist. So he was indeed, when he visited Russia and his offices were indeed raided, and he was active in politics. He started a museum that was designed to educate the working classes with diagrams rather than with language, because so many were illiterate. He was seen as a threatening figure by the right. So, as I say, he had at least 2 black marks against him. Most of the rest were Jewish or half Jewish. And so that was one reason why, when the fascists came to power in Austria in 1934, the Vienna Circle was quickly closed down, and some of the members of Vienna Circle began to leave Austria. A guy called Herbert Feigl was the first one to go. He left in 1931. It was already, even before the fascists had come to power, very difficult for Jewish thinkers to get university jobs. Karl Popper, who was never a member of the circle, but we haven't talked about him, but he was linked to the circle. He knew many of the members of the circle. It was clear that he was not going to get a job because, although he'd been baptized, his parents had converted to Protestantism, his Jewish origins, both his parents were ethnically Jewish, meant that he wasn't going to get a job. And yes, if you want, I can talk about what happened after Schlick's murder, but maybe you want to leave that to the end.
Yeah, you mentioned Popper, so we should jump on Popper. It's just because it's fascinating the way he views this thing, and I know from our last discussion that you find his grandstanding incredibly fascinating to look into, and it is in a way. But let's start with a slightly younger Popper before we get into some of the tremendous claims he makes about his impact on the circle. And let's start with a younger Popper, someone who is, even though he talks down how much he was interested in being a part of the circle, as a young man, he really was desperate to be a part of it. And it's Moritz Schlick that keeps him out because he sees the character of Popper. I think the phrase here, boorish, grandstander, intolerant bully, antagonistic listener.
Yeah, so not the kind of character you want as a member of a cohesive, amiable, if intellectually combative group. Uh, Popper was a difficult man. It always was. He always would be. And Slick recognised that. Popper was also rude about Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein, as we've already discussed, was Slick's intellectual hero, so that didn't help Popper's cause. So Popper always wanted to be a member of the circle, but was never invited to be a member of the circle. And he claims later in life a much greater distance between him and the circle than actually existed. Of course, all the things that Popper is interested in, and all the things he becomes really famous for, are areas that the circle themselves are fascinated by. So Popper's interests and the circle's interests almost entirely coincide, and Popper's intellectual life is shaped by the questions and the debates that the circle are having just beyond reach, but which he knows full well all about.
Bill, I mean, I didn't realize this, but they actually used his first book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, as well as one of their recommended reading lists. And if you were to read Popper in The Unending Quest, his biography, it is the complete opposite. So let's get into a slightly older Popper, and this is a Popper who is asked a question, not as bluntly as this, but who killed the Vienna Circle? And the quote from him is, "I fear I must take responsibility." And he labels himself also in a similar grand vein as the unofficial opposition. So as a slightly older Popper, how does he sit within the group? Because he certainly sees himself as having a very important role in its existence and also its downfall. But it's completely overblown, isn't it?
Completely overblown. They saw him, although he wasn't invited to the circle, as basically within their intellectual milieu. And The Logic of Scientific Discovery, the book he writes in the 30s, which isn't translated into English until much, much later, that book is again seen as engaging with the issues that they care about. He has a particular view about verificationism, which I shall briefly mention, which is why he says he killed off the circle, but they saw it as a perfectly legitimate engagement with the verification principle, in the same way they were all thinking about verificationism as well. But he does have a distinctive sort of take on it. So what Popper says about verificationism, he says that you can never, going back to David Hume and others, you can never show through inductive grounds that you can never prove anything through inductive grounds. So you can never prove that all swans are white, even if you see one white swan and another white swan and another white swan. Even if you see 1,000, 10,000 white swans, it doesn't prove that all swans are white. And the reason it doesn't prove that is because the next day you could go to your local pond and you could see a black swan, and that would disprove the claim that all swans were white. However many white swans you'd seen, it could be disproved. And so he said the way we should understand science is that science doesn't have verification built into it. What it has is falsification. And what science does is offer up theories which aren't proved, they are disproved. And good science tries to make as bold theories as it can to open itself up to being disproved. And that's what good science does. That's what a good scientist wants to do. They want to test their theories and have their theories disproved by a case that shows that they've got something wrong. And science advances not through verification, but through falsification. And that was Popper's distinctive contribution to the debate about verificationism.
There's also an element there, just before we get on to the last flourish here with the end and scene here, of some of the ways that Popper was, as you mentioned, was very much engaged in exactly the same ideas that the circle were engaged with and influenced by them. But he also took this, again, a slightly outsider attitude. So he's not, as you write in your book, he's not really interested in meaning. He mentions at one point that it simply bores him as a topic. He says that language in general, the idea of questions about language, that's also quite boring, quite tiresome. And he thinks the whole idea of pursuing clarity and precision is a futile act. And he changes the demarcation that they had, the demarcation between meaningful, and now he changes it to a demarcation between science and pseudoscience.
Yes, he always thought that the obsession with language was misplaced. And in fact, the first book I wrote, which was called Wittgenstein's Poker, was a dispute that took place in 1946 between Popper and Wittgenstein, not in Vienna, but in Cambridge. And although they both came from Vienna, and although they had both been on the edges of the Vienna Circle, neither of them had been a member of the Vienna Circle, and neither of them had met. So they met for the first time in Cambridge in 1946 on October the 25th. And the reason they had a row, and the book is all about this 10-minute row and whether or not Wittgenstein threatens Popper with a poker. The reason they had this row is that Wittgenstein, who is the chair of the Cambridge Philosophy Society called the Moral Science Club, Wittgenstein sends an invite through a proxy asking for this thinker, this philosopher, Karl Popper, who had spent the war years not in England, not in Vienna, but in New Zealand, and who has just arrived on a new job at the London School of Economics. He asks this newly arrived philosopher to come up to Cambridge and talk about a philosophical puzzle. And by that, Wittgenstein means to talk about a philosophical question that is all about language and which dissolves in the analysis of language. And Wittgenstein had come to believe that philosophical problems were actually philosophical puzzles. They were linguistic puzzles that actually we'd got into we saw them as problems. They were just puzzles which, if we understood how language was actually used, these puzzles would dissolve. And because Popper didn't believe that language was important, and he believed in problems, not in puzzles, he came to Cambridge and he titled his lecture, his talk, "Are There Philosophical Problems?" So this was bound to annoy Wittgenstein, who was preoccupied with language. And the point of Popper's talk was to say that language was irrelevant, very trivial, and that what mattered was problems and not puzzles.
That's a good step from Popper into the final scene here. And you write that Popper's use of language, this is a quote here, Popper's use of language when he raised the rhetorical question, who killed logical positivism, was unfortunate, because there really was a literal killing just afterwards. So I mentioned at the very beginning, that very brief overview of this scene where this young man, Neblock, a former student of Schlick's, murders him. And it's a tragic scene in some ways. This young man has been through psychiatric hospitals. He's infatuated with a young woman who's in turn infatuated with Schlick. He's using open anti-Semitism when he's and claims about the Vienna Circle when he thinks he's been denied a certain job that's been taken away from him. But he also does a lecture called A Critique of Logical Positivism at one point as well. And I'm not sure how much of this is just an attack on Schlick or simply an idea he really believes in. But there's a lot of threads that come together with this murder. So I might get you to take us there.
He was schizophrenic, and he'd been threatening Schlick for a long time. And Schlick was terrified of him, but thought that the threat had been overcome. And Schlick, as usual, takes the tram D, down from his house to the university. And on this particular day, June the 22nd, 1936, Nelbuk is there waiting for him and shoots him 4 times, and a witness hears him say, damn you bastard, there you have it, or words to that effect. In the criminal trial afterwards, and it was obvious that Nelbuk is guilty because he's literally found there, with the smoking gun in his hand. Nelbuk claims that he assassinated Slick not because he was worried that the woman who he was obsessed by was also having an affair with Slick, which seems to be, I think, the primary motivation, but because logical positivism was Jewish philosophy. And what's so fascinating about the murder is that the newspapers, straight after the murder, because obviously it's covered, there are not that many murders in Vienna, and also Slick is, an academic, a very highly respected academic, so obviously it's covered in all the newspapers, and some of the newspapers basically say that the gun that Nelbuk fired was fired again against a Jewish philosophy, and Slick is even described as Jewish, which he wasn't. And so already at the time of the murder, there are forces which are trying to exculpate Nelbuk, and he uses this in his trial. And indeed, after the Nazis come to power, he's eventually just released, and he lives out his life quite peacefully in Austria as a result. Whether by this stage he believed that he'd committed the crime because he was trying to take down logical positivism, or whether he understood that politically it was expedient to make that case, is unclear. But certainly that's how it was interpreted by several newspapers at the time of the murder.
So what does seem to take down positivism, if it wasn't Popper, of course, and it wasn't this young man, but it was in some ways the death of Schlick, but also that, as you mentioned, that change in atmosphere within Europe. Hitler's come to power. Soon he's going to take Austria itself. And many of these academics after Schlick, I think it's Gödel attempts suicide and has to be institutionalized for a while. He's quite hard dealt with. I think Menger decides he doesn't want anything to do with the circle anymore. It begins to crumble. Weissman seems to really try to keep it going, but the circle seems to limp along. And then, of course, Hitler comes to power, and all these wonderful academics become refugees, and they're fleeing. So I might get to take you to that horrible change in Europe, but also that atmosphere that was going around the minds of these men, and how the circle really did die, how it really did end.
Yeah, so there wasn't one moment when you could say the circle came to an end. The fascists come to power in 1934. Slick is murdered in 1936, and the Nazis come to power in 1938. We've discussed a few things about the circle that make them very vulnerable. The first is that many of them are Jewish. The second is that many of them are left-wing. And the third is that almost all of them are secular in an overwhelmingly Catholic country. They were also supporters, obviously, of the new physics, which was described by the Nazis as the Jewish physics. So they didn't have a profile that was very auspicious for the rise of fascism and the rise of Nazism. Because of their anti-metaphysical stance, they also posed intellectually a challenge to the fascists and to the Nazis. The Nazis had a deep metaphysical basis to their ideology. So, for example, Völkisch ideology, where they talk about a group being more than the sum of the individuals. The Nazis have this idea of this romantic attachment to the land. There's all sorts of elements, metaphysical elements of Nazism, which of course the logical positivists, being anti-metaphysics, would stand against. So they posed a threat to the fascists and to the Nazis. So by 1934, when the fascists come in, they're basically, their offices are shut down. They can no longer be public facing. They carry on meeting a bit together in private. Then Slick is murdered in 36. Then already the Jewish members realize they've got no future. Popper leaves and the others have already begun to leave. 1938, the Anschluss, and there's this orgy of violence when the Nazis take over, and as many people try to escape as quickly as they possibly can. And in the Vienna Circle's case, they move to either to the UK or to the United States. Gödel's an unusual case in that he's not Jewish. He could have stayed, possibly, but he leaves, but not in fact until I think 1940, when he moves to the States. There is there are a couple of members, non-Jewish members, who keep their heads down and stay in Austria throughout the war, and then help to try and revive it afterwards. But basically, the Vienna Circle has definitely come to an end, after the Anschluss, and the members of the Vienna Circle are scattered in all places, mainly America and the UK. But Popper, of course, has ended up in New Zealand. But yeah, it's gone by 1938, and the ideas of the Vienna Circle live on to some extent in the Anglo-American world post-war.
That should be the last question there. I was going to ask you, actually. What do you think the legacy is? I mentioned earlier this wonderful quote, and it comes from an interview I've seen. Many people probably have seen it themselves. It's Aya talking with Brian McGee about logical positivism. At the end of the interview, because it was a logical positivist, he asked him, what do you think the legacy, the question I'm asking you right now, what do you think the legacy of logical positivism was? And Aya says, and this is a quote, "I suppose the greatest defect is that nearly all of it was false." And he goes on to talk about how the verificationism didn't stack up, the reductionism never worked. But he then said, but there's an impetus behind it, an intention, which was wonderful and free, and it helped people like himself and many other philosophers and scientists around the world. So what do you think the legacy is of the Vienna Circle?
If I was to go for one element of the Vienna Circle that has persisted and which has influenced the rest of Anglo-American philosophy, I would say it was a desire for clarity and a suspicion of bullshit. I think their attack on people like Heidegger was an attack on philosophers who had kind of highfalutin ideas that were just unclear and difficult to comprehend. And their urge, their desire, what drove them as philosophers was a wish that their philosophy be clear, and be transparent and be open to criticism because it was expressed in language that people could understand. So if there was a single legacy of the Vienna Circle, and I think it is still regarded as a great virtue of Anglo-American philosophy, if there's a single legacy, it's this belief that philosophy should be as clear, as transparent as possible.
And that is a wonderful note to end the podcast on. The book is called The Murder of Professor Schlick, The Rise and Fall of the Vienna Circle, and I will link it thoroughly below the podcast itself. David Edmonds, thank you again so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you very much for inviting me.